It was the second week of November 1975, the kind of Connecticut cold that came early and stayed, frost on the windshields by 6 a.m., the smell of machine oil and burning leaves drifting together over the small mill town of Ashford Falls. Nathan Kessler was 19 years old. He stood just under 6 feet, worked as an apprentice machinist alongside his own father at the Ashford Falls Manufacturing Company, and had signed a lease 3 weeks earlier on a small studio apartment above the hardware store, set to move in that December. That is not a story about a young man's first apartment. That is a story about a mill town that trusted the wrong man for nearly 50 years. And it would take 49 years, a sealed time capsule, and a company anniversary nobody expected to matter to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that Thursday evening. Because to understand what Ashford Falls lost, you first have to understand who Nathan Kessler was. Ashford Falls in 1975 was a factory whistle town where 3 generations sometimes worked the same floor together, where the company softball team and the church choir drew from the same 20 families, and where a 19-year-old apprentice was watched over by half the shift whether he wanted it or not. It was a CB radio, muscle car, gas line kind of year. The country still working through Watergate's hangover, though Ashford Falls itself ran mostly on the factory clock instead of the news cycle. Nathan was the youngest of 4, the only one who'd followed his father onto the factory floor. And he was saving that lease money specifically so he could finally have space to practice the guitar he'd been teaching himself since sophomore year, an old acoustic passed down from an uncle. His father had taught him the trade himself, standing beside him at the same machine every day, proud in the quiet way factory fathers were proud. Nathan brought that guitar to the break room most Thursdays and played a few songs badly but happily, while men twice his age ate their sandwiches and needled him good-naturedly about his chords. He got on well with nearly everyone on the floor, including the well-liked shift foreman, Walter Prine, a bachelor in his 50s who played organ at First Congregational every Sunday, and who'd taken a particular interest in mentoring Nathan since he'd started, staying late some evenings to walk him through machine adjustments the manuals didn't cover well. Nathan was, by every account collected in the days that followed, the kind of kid a whole factory floor had unofficially adopted. That Thursday evening shift was supposed to end exactly like the hundreds before it, at 11:05 p.m. On Thursday, November 13, 1975, Nathan clocked out from the second shift and told a coworker he was staying a few extra minutes to get Prine's help adjusting a lathe he'd be running solo the next week. By 11:40, when Nathan's father, working the same shift, went to find him before driving home together as they always did, the machine floor was empty, except for Prine, who said Nathan had already left 20 minutes earlier on foot. By midnight, Nathan hadn't arrived home, a 15-minute walk he'd made hundreds of times. By 2 a.m., his father had walked the entire route himself twice and found nothing. By dawn, the guitar Nathan kept in his locker at the plant was still there, untouched, strings still in tune, a detail nobody understood the weight of for a long time. Ashford Falls PD began a search that morning along the walking route between the plant and the Kessler home. By the following night, there was nothing. No sign of a struggle. No witnesses on a cold, empty street at that hour. One young officer noted an unusual burn smell near the plant's old storage annex that night, dismissed at the time as normal factory odor, and logged a set of fresh drag marks near the annex's rear loading door that nobody followed up on for decades. Detective Carol Ann Doyle, one of only 2 female detectives the department had ever employed, caught the case, 34 years old and well aware that her colleagues watched her cases more closely than most. She knew the factory, having grown up 2 blocks from it, and she knew within days that a boy who loved his new apartment, his guitar, and his father, wasn't the type to simply walk off into the night. The department looked hard at a recently fired machinist with a grudge against factory management, and Doyle spent nearly 2 weeks building a case against him before payroll records placed him working a different job entirely across the state line that same night, clearing him completely. It was the first dead end, and it cost the investigation valuable early momentum. Meanwhile, Nathan's father walked that 15-minute route almost every night for months afterward, sometimes twice a night, and the factory floor itself organized search parties on weekends, 40 or 50 workers combing the riverbank in the woods behind the plant. But as winter set into a long Connecticut freeze, the search thinned to just the Kessler family. Then, some weeks, just Carol Ann Doyle, walking that same 15-minute route alone on her day off with the case file tucked under her arm. Underneath it all sat that burned smell and those drag marks near the storage annex, noted by a rookie officer who transferred departments within the year, his report boxed and mostly forgotten. By 1979, 4 years had passed, and the missing person flyer taped inside the hardware store window, right below the empty apartment Nathan never moved into, had gone the color of weak tea, but the shop owner never took it down. By 1986, Nathan's father had retired from the same machine floor he'd worked his whole career, walking past Prine, still foreman, on his last day, without either man saying much. By 1994, Carol Ann Doyle had made detective sergeant and, eventually, lieutenant, and every November 13th she pulled the Kessler file from a locked drawer in her own home office rather than the department archive. Because she didn't trust anyone else to keep asking the questions she still asked herself. Colleagues respected it quietly, mostly without comment. She never once treated it as closed. The case went cold in every official sense. No leads, a brief mention in the paper every 10th anniversary, but in the Kessler house, it never went cold at all. It simply became the weight everyone in that family carried without naming it out loud. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Nathan. The case had been cold for 49 years when something happened that no one, least of all Carol Ann Doyle, had anticipated. In 2024, Ashford Falls Manufacturing, marking its 100th anniversary before permanently closing its doors, opened a time capsule the company had sealed in the storage annex wall back in 1976. Intended to be opened only at the company's centennial. Alongside company newsletters and photographs, workers helping catalog the contents for a small local ceremony found a sealed metal tin that hadn't been part of the original capsule inventory list, wedged behind a support beam as though hidden rather than placed. Inside were Nathan Kessler's wallet, still holding his apprentice ID card, and a torn scrap of fabric matching the jacket his mother had described him wearing that night in 1975. The plant's retiring general manager, uneasy, called the Ashford Falls police directly. The case landed on the desk of a young detective named Renee Ashworth, who tracked down Carol Ann Doyle, 78 years old by then, retired for over a decade. Doyle drove to the station herself the same afternoon, and when she saw the tin's contents, she said only, "That annex." I always came back to that annex. Modern forensic testing recovered a viable biological sample from the fabric scrap and cross-referenced it against a DNA sample voluntarily provided years earlier by Walter Prine's grandnephew during an unrelated genealogy project, the familial link close enough to justify a direct warrant. Prine himself, 92 years old, was still alive, living in an assisted care facility 2 towns over. Walter Prine had been, by every account the factory could offer, a steady and respected presence. The foreman who mentored young apprentices and played organ every Sunday at First Congregational for over 40 years. That reputation, ironically, was exactly what had kept anyone from looking twice at him in 1975. In hindsight, there were small things. He'd been the one to suggest, in the days after Nathan vanished, that searchers focus on the riverbank rather than the plant grounds themselves, steering attention firmly away from the annex where he'd last claimed to see Nathan walking off alone. He'd requested a transfer to the day shift within a year of Nathan's disappearance, a detail nobody had reason to question until now. Investigators obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from Prine in his care facility, and the match to the fabric scrap came back at odds of 1 in several billion. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 2 detectives and a uniformed officer arrived at the assisted living facility, and a frail 92-year-old man was taken into custody in a wheelchair, an oxygen tube trailing behind him, while stunned staff and residents watched from the hallway. Word moved through what remained of Ashford Falls's factory community within hours, the way it does even in towns whose mill has since gone quiet. Text message. Phone call. Old coworkers calling other old coworkers they hadn't spoken to in years. What moved through town wasn't hope. It was disbelief curdling into something closer to grief for a story that had shaped an entire generation of factory families. Men in their 70s and 80s who had once worked that same machine floor beside Prine and thought of him as a mentor, sat with the news for days, unable to reconcile the organist they'd known with the man now under arrest. Given his age and health, Prine was found competent to understand the charges, but was hospitalized before any trial could proceed, and passed away 8 months later in custody, the case formally closed by the district attorney's office based on the DNA match, the recovered evidence, and decades-old officer notes finally connected to Doyle's own persistence. Nathan Kessler would have turned 68 the year his case was finally closed. His father did not live to see it. He passed in 2009, having walked that same 15-minute route between the plant and home one final time on the 30th anniversary of Nathan's disappearance, alone, before he grew too frail to manage it. But Nathan's older sister did, 74 years old, standing outside the old Ashford Falls plant the day the county announced its findings, the building itself now slated for redevelopment into apartments. Carol Ann Doyle was there too, 78 years old, holding the same case file she'd kept in a locked drawer for 3 decades. Asked afterward why she'd never let the case go, she said she'd promised herself, the night she stood on that empty 15-minute walking route as a young detective nobody fully trusted yet, that Nathan Kessler would not become a name nobody asked about anymore. She said she wanted him to still have somebody looking. Today, as the old plant is converted into housing, developers have agreed to preserve the storage annex as a small commemorative space, with Nathan's name and a photograph of him holding his old guitar mounted near the entrance. It is easy, in stories like this, to talk about the monster and forget the boy. But Nathan Kessler was not defined by what was taken from him. He was defined by a lease he signed with hope, by a guitar he never stopped learning, by a father who walked the same lonely road looking for him for over 30 years. What does it take for an entire factory community to trust the wrong man for nearly 5 decades? What does it mean that the truth sat sealed behind a support beam the whole time, waiting only for a building to close its doors before it could be found? And what do we owe the people who keep a case warm in a locked drawer for 30 years after everyone else has moved on? Nathan Kessler waited 49 years for someone to ask the right question. Carol Ann Doyle made sure someone finally did. Justice found Nathan Kessler after 49 years. Stories like his are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.